And if you're feeling really uncomfortable about having these conversations, it's a great idea to do before anything, like before anybody's touching anything or any clothes come off when you're in a non-sexual situation, or just like you kind of know it's going to head in that direction if there's an opportunity for that. Just being like, hey, letting you know that like I tend to get distracted, I might need to adjust some things, or like that's just how I work, and or or I really like when the music's playing, or hey, like dirty talk or eye contact really help me stay engaged with things. So like if you're into that, I'd really love it. Or like asking for what you need in that way can be a lot less intimidating than asking for it during sex.
Welcome to the Given Consent podcast. The goal of this show is to introduce you to the people and ideas behind sex positivity, and ultimately consent culture. Today, I'm joined by certified sex and relationship coach and educator, Rachael Rose. She custom tailors her coaching using a sex positive approach, helping her clients create the sex life and relationships that they want. She specializes in helping those with chronic illness, health issues, ADHD, and those on the spectrum. She recently gave a great workshop to Sex Positive World all about ADHD and anxiety and how that plays out in our sex lives and relationships. And I personally got so much out of it and what she had to say. My friends, please welcome Rachael Rose.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm excited to dive into a little bit about ADHD and then get into like chronic illness also. So where I thought we would start is there's so much to dive into here. Distractions and having a distracted mind. And that's a lot of what we're looking at with ADHD because and even if you don't have a diagnosis of ADHD, the reality is attention spans are getting shorter because we live in a world of constant distraction. So it can create a lot of issues around creating intimacy between you and a partner or partners, which you talked about in your workshop. So I'd like to ask you about what happens to those who are more distracted, like socially, like how does it affect their lives? And then how that's related to anxiety.
So I think that we're all very distracted lately. I think, especially in this last year where we're all kind of going through this like global trauma of this pandemic. And then working from home is another factor in like, one, the expectations that potentially employers or other social family needs are putting on us because things have shifted so much. So that can be very distracting in itself. And I think you're right. I think that that there are a lot of ways that attention spans are not necessarily like, I think that there are some studies showing that generally attention spans are getting somewhat shorter, but also I think that there's just more needs being put on us that are distracting us. So it's not, we're expected to be available for working pretty much 24/7 to some degree, depending on how, your place of employment navigates it, or whatever the case may be. And that definitely plays a role in relationships. Anxiety very closely is linked to ADHD because about half of people who have ADHD also have anxiety. And that's really common. And there's a lot of ways that can play out in relationships. There isn't like, I don't think there's really a way to say like generally how that plays out with everybody. I think that there are a lot of different ways that it can play out that possibly can change how that dynamic works with people. A lot of times anxiety can exacerbate pretty much anything. Much like stress makes everything worse, so does anxiety. Anxiety has the possibility of doing exactly the same thing. It can make it even harder or more difficult for someone who has ADHD to follow through on tasks or pay attention to something. It can also make them more distracted because now you're not only distracted by external stimuli or what's going on in your head, you're also distracted by your anxiety. And those two things can like bounce back and forth and play off of each other in like just a really less than ideal way. And that can just kind of make it harder to get turned on, to stay in the moment, to be present with partners, and to make people feel like you're there with them and present in the way that you want to show up in a relationship.
Yeah. I think that this is also one where people kind of are like, just get over it. We all get distracted. And you talked about in the workshop this idea of rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I think those two things are related. So what is rejection sensitive dysphoria?
So rejection sensitive dysphoria, it's not necessarily like an officially recognized term, but it tends to be one that is unofficially recognized by folks in the ADHD community. again, it typically takes like quite a while for things to become to go through all the processes that make it an official term, and then have diagnostic criteria and whatever that go with it. But what it generally is an extreme emotional sensitivity and emotional pain that's triggered by the perception, which isn't always the same as reality of the situation, that a person's been rejected, teased, criticized, etc., by important people in their life. So it might be something. One of the ways that shows up in relationships is like if you're sensitive about being criticized about certain things about yourself. So let's say you're somebody, just thinking of like a general example I hear a lot with ADHDers, somebody who is easily distracted or not. Maybe there are people who forget a lot of things, right? You forget to do things that are important. So maybe you live with somebody and you forget to take the trash out, or to mail the thing you need to mail, or do all the adulting tasks that are absolutely no fun and nobody wants to do anyway. If that's something you feel really sensitive about because it's something you've received a ton of criticism about throughout your life, and then your partner criticizes you about it, it can hit a lot harder because it's already something that you tend to feel sensitive about. And while that happens with everybody, regardless of ADHD or anxiety, it sometimes like ADHDers can be hypersensitive, and that can show up in emotional ways as well. So like those emotions can feel extra intense for people who have that and experience, who have ADHD and experience RSD, than it might for anybody, for people who don't fit into those demographics.
Yeah. And on top of that, as you were talking about things like rejection sensitive dysphoria, it for me started like turning the gear a little bit, where I was like, oh, I've experienced that too, because it turns out, especially if you're raised as a lady, you generally don't get diagnosed. I thought that was really interesting. What's kind of the facts behind that?
So some studies show that about 75% of people who are assigned female at birth, who have ADHD, don't have a diagnosis. And a big part of that is that it's not. I saw a research article that was praising a doctor in 2003, so not that long ago, for being the first person to look at ADHD in girls. I believe I was diagnosed, I think, a few years before that, and I personally only have a diagnosis because my younger brother, who has the very stereotypical hyperactive boy presentation, received a diagnosis, and my parents were just like, well, we should get her tested too. The studies that were done that led to the diagnostic criteria that we have for ADHD was done based on little boys who all happened to be white in the 1970s. So a lot of the ways that it actually shows up for people, especially those who are socialized as girls, isn't really reflected in the diagnostic criteria. And that leads to a huge misunderstanding of what that looks like, and then also those people getting diagnosed.
How is it different for those who are socialized female as opposed to male?
I think that like it varies. There's a lot of different theories about like whether there's actually differences in the way it would present, because you can't really take out the factors of how we're socialized. It's kind of, we could sit around debating it forever. My personal thoughts on the matter are that the way that girls are socialized, and this is something I've read in many places as well, is that there's the boys will be boys kind of aspect of it, that we kind of allow boys to have a lot of leeway on things, and how we're socializing them and how they behave, that we don't allow girls to have. So girls end up finding a lot of other ways to mask their ADHD symptoms, because they're criticized basically to the point where that's the only way that is acceptable to behave. So and it tries to show up. There are some ways that can show up a little bit differently, from what I've read. While hyperactivity tends to be more external for boys, and that could very much be that they're more allowed to do that based on socialization. For girls, it can be other things. It could be, hyperactive can also be how your brain works. I never identified as actually, even though I had the diagnosis, I never identified as having ADHD really until I was actually in my late 20s, because I was like, I'm just a head in the clouds kind of person. Like, I don't really think I don't fit this. This is like, I saw how it presented in my brother, and that didn't fit me at all. I'm nothing like that. But when I heard that that the hyperactivity could be mental, I was like, oh man, that's totally me. Like, my brain never stops going. I have 1,000 things happening in there at all times. That things that girls tend to do are things, like it more often can present as like being a very, very talkative person. I never stop talking. I've been criticized for that most of my life. And then also people who are socialized as girls tend to respond to all this criticism that they receive by becoming more people pleasers and using that as a way to try to fit in a neurotypical world that we don't necessarily fit into. And they can develop all these life hacks and masking their symptoms. And usually when they are people who are going to receive a diagnosis, it starts to happen in college, because suddenly the structure that they've had their whole lives of being in school and being told what to do to like such an extent, that starts to fall apart in college because you don't have those same structures in place. And that's when people's coping mechanisms and life hacks for those, for like navigating those differences can sometimes become more challenging because they don't work in the same way anymore.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I knew so many people who are not diagnosed but talk about the same thing: racing thoughts, constant thoughts all over the place. And on the opposite end of that is that those with ADHD also have this thing that they're hyper focused on something. So it's like you're all over the place or you're hyper focused. It's one or the other, and it actually plays out like time can work completely differently. Like, how does that play out for an ADHD person?
So ADHD, which stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's kind of a misnomer. I saw a tweet recently that was like, it's kind of funny that this is named for how it inconveniences other people and not actually how you experience it. Because the fact of the matter is, it's not so much that we don't have attention, it's that we really aren't always great or able to direct where that attention goes. But hyperfocus is something that kind of engages when you find us like, I don't know an ADHDer who doesn't have like just their passion projects, the things that they are just super into. And if you get them talking about it, they will not stop. And there's usually a whole bunch of them. And those are things that like just they tend to love. It doesn't necessarily have to always be that type of thing. Me personally, I've yet to find a craft project I haven't already tried. Like that's I go in cycles with it and hyper focus on those. But also just, you ever have a day where you learn something on the internet and then it takes you to another page, and next thing you know, 12 hours have passed and you have learned all about this random topic that had nothing to do with the thing that you were supposed to get done that day. That is hyper focus. You forget that you need to eat or go pee or do whatever you got to do. And won't even often notice the passing of time. And that is just that you get so engrossed in what is happening that you're really just hyper focused on it. And it's kind of like an ADHD superpower that's not always a positive thing, depending on when you're doing it and if you're supposed to be doing something else.
Yeah, 100%. And what I also like to just jump into is like how that plays out for relationships, especially when we're talking about new relationships, when you're already obsessed with the new person you're with. And on top of it, you can be hyper focused. And then later, you're not so hyper focused. So how do we see that playing out in relationships for ADHDers?
It can be really challenging, especially in relationships. So, excuse me. I think everybody to varying degrees experiences NRE in relationships, and what that stands for is new relationship energy. It's that like all the happy hormones and like positive feelings you have with the new person in your life, and you're just super excited about it, and you want to talk to them all the time and talk about them and see them. And obviously not everybody experiences that the exact same way, but it's usually something adjacent to those feelings. When it comes to ADHDers, a lot of the time, and obviously you can't generalize, not everybody's the same, like people are going to experience things differently, but a lot of the time, we NRE real hard. And this is actually a point of interest of mine. I'm working on a book with Dr. Liz Powell about ADHD, sex, and relationships by and for ADHDers. There's just nothing out there that's really sex positive and captures that. So we're running a survey right now because I want to find out if we NRE much harder than neurotypical folks. But my theory is that we do. And so what that looks like is like, we want to talk to them. We're just showering our new partners in attention. And we want to get to know everything about them. We want to, you're just showing, you are just kind of not quite obsessed with them, but you're giving them all the time and attention and focus. And The problem with that is it's not sustainable. And so that can feel super jarring to a partner when suddenly it's not that you've lost interest in them, although that is possible. But for most folks, at some point, you just, all of the other factors that exist in your life, the things that the work you have to do, taking care of your dog, family things, other responsibilities, other friends that you want to spend time with, all those things start to creep back in. And suddenly it can feel to your partner like they're losing something, because you originally had all this time and energy and focus to put on them that wasn't ever realistic or sustainable in the first place. And that can be a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, yeah. And I also like that as we were getting into it, because like relationships have natural cycles that they want to move through,
Mm-hmm.
is how it also affects well, you talked about like urgency and procrastination being kind of the states of mind that you're oscillating between as an ADHD person. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is like how that comes out like at the intimacy level when you're wanting to get close with somebody and you're like, wait, I have to take care of this. Wait, I have to take care of that. When you lose your hyper focus, like how does that play out?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So urgency and procrastination kind of go hand in hand with ADHDers. We have the way that time tends to, like the way that I hear it often described for ADHDers, it's now or not now. There's not really like a dial. It's like a switch for in a lot of ways. And so, if it's not due right this second, I can put it off till later because my brain is, so ADHD is a dopamine dysregulation disorder, really, which means that like ADHDers don't have the same amount of dopamine that neurotypical folks do. And that is something that helps you with your executive functioning skills and helps you get the thing done, whatever the thing is. So often we need to find other ways to create that dopamine and urgency, whether it is a positive or negative, including when it's like really stressful and it's the night before, like a huge paper is due or something else equally important that you just like didn't get done. That urgency, that need to get it done, can stimulate all the same brain chemicals that you need to do the thing. So suddenly, instead of spending weeks putting off this important paper, you can get it done in like 4 hours and write a perfect paper and be done with it. But you got really stressed out and had to create that sense of urgency to get to that point. What that means is that sometimes, especially in long-term relationships where you have a lot of availability, especially maybe in a year where you've both been in a house for a whole year or something else that looks like that, when something's available all the time, that also means that it can be hard to create that kind of interest because there is no urgency. There's no sense of like, it's not that you don't want to have that intimacy with your partner. It's that it's available all of the time. And so, you can do it in a few minutes and then you get caught up doing something else. And then that something else takes over and you get hyper focused on it. Or something else is like, oh, but let me do one more thing and let me do one more other thing. And next thing you know, it's too late and your partner fell asleep 2 hours ago. And you forgot to leave time to spend with them or to have that intimacy with them. And obviously that plays out in a lot of different ways, but that's kind of a pattern that can occur for folks.
Yeah, totally. And I also want to talk a little bit just about distraction that happens when you do actually get in bed with your partner and it's starting to get hot, and then suddenly the TV is on and that's all you can think about, or what have you. Like, how do you navigate all of that distraction in the moment, especially when you're sensitive to maybe like, oh, please don't judge me, but I have to go turn these things off?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. So I think there's a big element of it. And in the workshop that I taught for a sex positive world, and that I've taught in other places, is that I talk a lot about the science behind this stuff. And the reason for that is that when we don't talk about things and we don't understand why they're happening, it's really easy to feel shameful about them and to have a lot of shame or guilt or think that there's something wrong with us or that we're broken or that we're weird because we need to do this thing that somebody else didn't need to do. And the fact of the matter is sure, you might be different, but that's not necessarily a problem. Different is just different. And that when you have more of an understanding of why these things are happening, it can be a lot easier to like be patient and kind with yourself in a way that you're then setting up the expectation for how others, I think, should handle things. So if you don't treat it like it's a weird thing that you need to mute the television because it's distracting you during sex, no one else is it's like other people are probably going to fall in line with that expectation and be like, it's not a weird thing. It's just a thing you had to do. Obviously, there are people who are probably going to be jerks about it. Maybe you shouldn't be having sex with them, in my opinion, if they're not going to be kind to you. So the fact of the matter is, yeah, you can feel kind of uncomfortable needing to do things to make yourself more comfortable. But I think the partners that are going to be a good fit for you are going to be ones who want you to be comfortable. If somebody is in a situation where they honestly don't feel like they can ask for what they need, whether that is an ADHD type adjustment, like the fan is bothering you because it's on and it's making you cold, or maybe it's too hot in the room, or maybe the sheets are bunching under your knees, or something isn't comfortable, or the TV is playing, or the music is distracting you, whatever the case is. If you feel like you can't bring that up, maybe it's time to take a step back and think about why this person doesn't make you feel like you're comfortable enough to speak up about what you need. And so I think that's one way to navigate it, is to look at those things, because there's really nothing wrong in needing to adjust your comfort level so that you can enjoy sex or whatever is happening, whatever kind of play you want to have, so that it works better for you. And I think that most people would want whoever they're with to be as comfortable as possible and enjoy themselves as much as possible. So a lot of ways that I'll bring that up for me personally is I'll be like, so let's say, so the TV being on and having like a show on or something like that, even if it's one I don't have any interest in, that's personally very distracting to me because I can't stop listening to whatever's happening. And I really just want to be paying attention to the person I'm with. So I'll just tell them that. I'll be like, listen, this is distracting me and I really want you to have my undivided attention because I'm super enjoying this. And I'm just going to mute this real quick, and I'll lean over, mute it, and then we get to go back to having fun. Rather than me sitting there the whole time trying to tune out the television, which is just going to distract me the entire time. And so I find that like just navigating the thing and making the change is a lot easier and less disruptive to having a great time with whoever you're with than it is trying to pretend like your brain doesn't work the way it does.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that. And like part of what we do in sex positive world, and I encourage people to do, is to have that conversation about sex before you're having the sex. Like
Totally.
What works, what's not going to work. And like that's on my list. And like, if it's music where I know the lyrics, it will distract me. If it's a TV show where there's lots of talking and sound effects, especially, like it will distract me. And feeling out if that person's really going to understand where I'm coming from. And then on top of that, like checking in with people while you're actually making love or getting hot and heavy, where you can have a pause and, check in with each other. Is this working for you? And I feel like I'm just so distracted. I just really need a sip of water or whatever. A lot of people, I think they think it breaks flow, but it can actually just really re-engage things in a nice way.
I think people who think that asking for what you need, whatever that is, whether that's a sip of water or asking for like to be touched a different way, or for someone to do a thing that they're not doing, or to maybe give some direction about how you want to be touched, if that's ruining the mood, or they think it's going to ruin the mood, like that's not very, like there's so many creative ways to do those things that make it hotter, or even just take a pause. Like there are so many different ways to like just sometimes having a moment just to kind of like collect yourself for whatever you need to do means that like when you go back to it, like everybody's way more engaged, way happier, way more turned on, like because you had your needs met. Not having what you need is extremely distracting. And I don't think it has any, maybe it's more distracting for ADHDers. I don't know, but I think it's distracting for everybody to at least some degree.
Yeah, totally. Especially if you're uncomfortable by something, like, or at least for me, if I'm physically uncomfortable because of something like weird sheets or I'm off balance or whatever, like, I'm like, I need to change. Yeah.
And I fully agree with what you said about making sure to have like, so like, and if you're feeling really uncomfortable about having these conversations, it's a great idea to do before anything, like before anybody's touching anything or any clothes come off when you're in a non-sexual situation, or just like you kind of know it's going to head in that direction if there's an opportunity for that. Just being like, hey, letting you know that like I tend to get distracted. I might need to adjust some things, or like that's just how I work. And or or I really like when the music's playing, or hey, like dirty talk or eye contact really help me stay engaged with things. So like if you're into that, I'd really love it. Or like asking for what you need in that way can be a lot less intimidating than asking for it during sex.
Yeah, totally. I think too, there's a lot of like sweetness and getting into it, because like so sometimes for people, like it's like the sex is like very jarring and separate from everything else you're doing, so like taking time to ease in and get the focus where you want it to be is also really important.
I honestly think having those kind of conversations, especially depending on how you do it, can be in itself foreplay. Everybody's getting in the right headspace, and you're talking about sexy things, even if it's not in a sexual context. And like you can ask each other what you're into or what you like or how you like to be touched or what they want out of this, like whatever. You can have all these things, and that in itself, like your brain can kind of run wild with all those mental images, and you're already having that kind of connection, and that can be really intimate and sexy in itself. So like instead of looking at it as like this awkward conversation you need to have before sex, like just think of it as part of like what you do to get to that point and how to make it sexier.
Yeah. And I think because we're socialized not to talk about sex generally, especially as Americans, it's very taboo. It can be really uncomfortable. So it's something you just have to keep practicing and practicing and practicing. And I like to be really open, even like with my platonic friends, just because the more you talk about it, the more you're just like, oh, now I can ask for what I want and change things up.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways to work on those, like to build those skill sets that aren't even related to sex. So like asking for what you need when you're with friends in a platonic situation, or speaking up or saying no to something. No, you don't want to go see that movie. So like let's say you were in a sexual situation where you don't want to do the thing, you're a no to something, but you're a yes to something else. You can totally practice that with like, actually, I don't want to see that movie, but I'd really love to see this one. Is that something you feel up for? It's the same thing. It's about a different topic. So like there's lots of ways to like work on having boundaries or asking for what you need or having tough conversations that you can do in different situations to help get more comfortable with them before you're ever in a sexual situation.
Let's see here. Kind of a topic shift is this is related to ADHD, and also the other topic that you tend to deal with in chronic pain is that medications can create side effects and like social problems that maybe you don't anticipate. So like what's the reality of medication side effects and how it affects libido?
Oh, it's a big question because there are countless medications and they all have different side effects, and a lot of them have a variety of sexual side effects depending on the person. So one thing I like to remind people is that just because so doctors can be very dismissive about side effects, especially when it comes to sexuality. Probably even more so if you were somebody who was assigned female at birth. I know I've dealt with it personally. It's not great to have your concerns dismissed in that way, and also go into it knowing that doctors statistically get 8 to 10 hours of sex education during the entire training, their entire medical training. So they're probably more uncomfortable talking about it than you are, and that probably is why they're more dismissive. But also, just because something is an unknown side effect for a medication does not mean it cannot be a side effect for you. I think people know their bodies extremely well and know what's going on with themselves. So don't like ignore your doctor, but recognize that you probably have a better idea of how your body feels and what's happening with you. And then that's something you need to learn and figure out how to communicate to that doctor. Hopefully they'll be willing to hear it in that way. So with that in mind, there are countless different types of sexual side effects. There's SSRIs and SNRIs, which can be used for anxiety, depression, and sometimes chronic pain issues. I think a variety of other things probably as well, that are well known for causing things like loss of sex drive, anorgasmia, which is the inability to have sex. I'm sorry, an orgasm, not sex. So there's also things that like I was at a doctor's office recently, and I took a photo of a thing that was a paper that was taped to the wall, and it was like medications that can cause vaginal dryness. And there were over 300 medications on there. I'm on several of them because I have a number of chronic conditions. And while I knew some of them had that effect, no doctor has ever told me that was a side effect of that medication. It was usually something I Googled myself or figured out from personal experience or some other factor. Medications can cause some medications can cause priapism, which is a persistent and painful erection of the penis. Other ones can cause erectile dysfunction. I mean, you name it, it's possible. And so it can be a challenging thing to navigate because sometimes it's a really hard decision as to whether or not the benefits of the medication outweigh the side effects. And for each person, that's going to be a different answer, and depending on the situation and what condition it's treating.
And I think as we notice those things, it's important to remember, like you were saying with the doctors, is they're probably uncomfortable with this. So like being able to advocate for yourself, or even if you have to like write it down in advance, like that's really important to get them to focus on the fact that this medication is not working for you.
Mm-hmm. And actually writing it down in advance is a really great way to navigate those situations. So usually, at least in the United States, insurance companies generally, depending on, like, unless it's like a first appointment or like a specific unless they bill it a certain way, they get 15 minutes per patient. So if you feel like you're being rushed out of the room, it's probably because you are, because that's all insurance will pay for. And that's how they make money. And they need just enough patients to like keep their practice running. So it's like a delicate balance of things. So sometimes if you have a list of questions that you want to talk about, one, it can help with that kind of overwhelming feeling that you get when you're in a doctor's office and they're rushing you around and trying to, not hearing what you're saying. And you're like, that way you don't get, I know for me, I have countless doctor's appointments and I still get overwhelmed and forget what I want to say. So that's really great for that kind of a thing. Sometimes doctors will be like, actually hand me your list, and they'll go through each one and answer them. And that will kind of help them keep on their timeline, but be able to address all of your questions. Sometimes if you feel like you're really not being heard, and finding another doctor is not an option because for a lot of people and insurance reasons, it's not. If you're able to, and the rules might be a little different during COVID. I don't know if it's an option, but outside of COVID, if you have a partner or a trusted friend that you can bring with you, sometimes having another person with you who's not so emotionally wrapped up in the situation that's happening, because it is emotional. You're advocating for your health, and that can be a lot. But having someone else there kind of like be on your side can be really helpful with that. Even if they just sit there and don't say anything, but especially if there's somebody who you'd feel comfortable allowing to speak up on your behalf if you feel like they were dismissive about your question, having someone else be like, actually, I don't feel like you answered the question that they asked, can be something that's really helpful. And then also you're kind of in like a 2-against-1 situation. So that kind of, I always personally find that to be a little beneficial as well, if needed.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I've personally experienced that working well with doctors where I'm like, no, I really need you to hear this out. So it works, maybe not 100% of the time, but it does work.
Statistically better than if you don't have it, I think. But yeah, it's not foolproof. And unfortunately, there are really wonderful doctors out there who you don't need to come up with all these solutions for. And then there's ones out there who, no matter what you do, they're unfortunately probably not going to hear what you have to say. And it's just a matter of trying to figure out how to best advocate for yourself in each one of those situations.
Yeah. So on the topic of chronic pain, because I want to hit that before we're out of time.
Yeah,
when you're working with a client who's dealing with chronic pain issues and how it's affecting their intimacy, like how do you help them move through that process? Or because you tend to custom tailor, like what's maybe an example of how you've worked through that with someone?
So, so there are a lot of different ways that chronic pain or even chronic illness, which necessarily doesn't have to be chronic pain related, but that can also very much impact sex. And, obviously there's going to be a very different situation if I'm talking to somebody who has pain from penetration versus somebody who's in a wheelchair and might have more mobility issues, or someone who has like a shoulder problem. You're going to want to navigate all of those different things and concerns very differently. Thus the custom tailored thing, because it can't, like, there's not like a one size fits all answer for this. But, good examples are, I've had clients who have lichen sclerosis, which is it's kind of hard to explain. It's the way that this is like not a scientifically accurate definition at all. But it's kind of like having, I guess the closest thing is like eczema, but like on a mucous membrane often. For example, it often presents on vulvas, and it can be really painful. It can thin the skin, and if it's not treated, it can lead to other health issues. But it can cause a lot of pain with penetration or physical contact, friction. Like even clothing can be really uncomfortable if it's not treated. And so, I've had clients who felt like they couldn't have a real relationship because they couldn't have quote unquote real sex. And like couldn't have a real sexual, like quote unquote real sexual relationship with a partner. And so they were trying to figure out other ways around that. And I was, we sat down, we talked, and I was saying, like, I don't know what you mean. Like, what do you mean? Like, what do you define as sex? Because I think often when we feel like we can't engage in sex, it's more that our definition of sex is very limiting, that it is that, and listen, there are exceptions to every rule. I'm sure that there are plenty of ways that people have chronic pain or illness issues that do stop them from engaging in like various forms of intimacy, because I know that at different points that can be really a challenging thing depending on where you're at. But in this case, we talked a lot about what the definition of sex was for that person and how to, like, because honestly, with being a little bit more creative about it, like there are so many ways to have a great sex life. I have had threesomes where my underwear never came off because I personally have a lot of on and off vulva pain issues, where like mutual masturbation is a really great go-to if you want to have something sexy and intimate, but like it could just be because you're tired, but it also could be because like you're in pain and don't want your body touched. I know that there at various points, there have been times where, while I've gotten better at like communicating to partners what parts of my body don't feel good and where I do not want to be touched at that point. There are times where I don't know something hurts until someone touches it. And then I'm like, every time they touch me, I'm like giving some kind of negative feedback. Oh, actually not there, not there. No matter how nicely you do it, at some point it's like not that sexy, if it's a day where like pain's really, really an issue for me, because for me it varies quite a bit. So maybe those are a great option to enjoy like mutual masturbation, because I get to touch myself and avoid the parts that don't feel good and still have this like sexy, intimate connection with my partner. Because one, it's hot to watch your partner touch themselves. Like that can be so much fun in itself. Sex doesn't necessarily have to look a certain way. And I think by kind of sitting down and thinking like, okay, what's hot to me, what's sexy to me, like what am I going to enjoy, rather than looking at it as like sex is the specific act. You can find a lot of different ways to enjoy yourself. And, I also think that it can be a challenge to work through feelings about, there's also is like, always going to be, I think, a little bit of grief if you're not able to have sex the way that you want to, because you're like, it can be hard not to focus on like but I want to do it that way and I can't. And so I'm going to like, your attention kind of gets focused on that. And I think that when it comes to chronic illness, there's a lot of grief that you need to work through. And that's a process. And if you're not there yet, where you're at a point where you're like trying other things that might feel really good to you, seems like a good thing. Like be patient with yourself, because it's like a process. Like it can be a lot to be chronically ill or have chronic pain issues. And so sometimes there's other stuff that you need to work through for yourself to get to a point where that seems like a fun idea. But at some point also, hopefully that you'll get there, and that's something that clients and I also work through sometimes.
I think something that was really eye-opening for me in my process was seeking the pleasure instead of the orgasm.
Yeah.
And learning that there is actually a big difference, because I was socialized in a religious environment where it was like, there's all this stuff and then there's the sex and we're all just trying to get to the sex. And I think a lot of people end up there, because what you're talking about, like suggesting to somebody that you mutually masturbate, can be really arresting, because we don't stop in those intimate places and just share that with people. We tend to go kind of like fast when we're trying to get to that, or to what your idea of sex is, that it has to be like penetration. So I think there's a lot here that makes things really juicy and fun and can help you to find pleasure in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree. Focusing on pleasure is a really fun place to start. Like, and I also am a huge fan of the idea of like experiment dates or sex labbing, whatever you want to call it, which kind of is just like a pressure-free environment where you're going to try out some stuff and see what feels good. And like, you can be awkward and it's not supposed to be sexy. You don't have to worry about ruining the mood. You just kind of agree that you're like, if you want to try like spanking someone and we've never done it before, and you're going to be like awkward and weird, maybe terrible at it or something, like make it a fun thing. Be like, wait, like, can I try this with you? And then you could try it to me, or whatever, however you want to negotiate that. And it can be goofy and fun. And like, not only can that be sexy and help you figure out what actually does feel good to your body, because especially if you have chronic pain or illness, like that can shift a lot. What felt good last month might not feel good today or tomorrow, or a year from now. So, having moments where you can kind of just play around with things that you think you might be interested in to see what actually feels good, what parts of your body feel good to be touched, in what ways. And just the playfulness of that, and like having an environment like that in itself can be super sexy and fun. Because like, who doesn't like to like, adults don't play enough. We need to, like, that's a fun thing to incorporate with that. So, make it its own fun thing to do. And also you're exploring what feels good to your body, like the body that you have right now. And sometimes it's hard to get out of your head about the way your body used to work. Like that's a huge thing for a lot of people, myself included sometimes. So figuring out what feels good to you right now can be a really great way of figuring out how to navigate that stuff.
Before I ask my last question, where can people find you if they want to know more and seek you out?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Hedonish. That's HEDONISH. And you can find me on my website for other sex ed resources and content. And also, if you're interested in coaching, which is www.hedonish.com.
Awesome. And my last question is, what's one piece of advice that you give our listeners, like something they could actually start doing to improve their sex life?
When we talked about this before, I was like, I had a perfect idea and it totally slipped my mind. But I honestly, I know I've already mentioned it, but honestly, my favorite piece of advice to give people is to just be creative about how you experience sexual things and sexuality, and to figure out what feels good to you, figure out what feels good for your body, and recognize that like that being different than whatever you were taught was normal, or quote unquote normal, or what you think you're supposed to enjoy, like as much as you can. And obviously it is a huge process. It's far easier said than done, but like put that aside so that you can focus on what really does feel good to you, like what you actually want, what you actually enjoy. A lot of us are really saddled with this like societal expectations about what we're supposed to be doing, or supposed to like, or supposed to want. And honestly, that just really gets in the way of actually enjoying things, or living the life you want to live, or the way that you want to do things. So put that aside and really think about what feels good to you, and how you can enjoy yourself, and what you really want.
I love that. Focusing in on what's going to bring you pleasure so that you can communicate it. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I learned so much. And until next time, we'll see you then.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you want to see more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that we end up in your feed. If you got something out of this personally that was helpful to you, also please leave a comment below. I love hearing the feedback about what's working and what's not. That's what makes this show better. And until next time, love you more, and we'll see you then.